a study to see if new laws were needed to protect the public against excessive use of power by labor unions. Have you decided whether such new laws are needed, and if so, what would they do?
Mr. McGee, I am planning a speech on that subject next week, also so that we can get the opportunity for the questioners to question me. It will be before the next television debate. I will say simply in advance of it that I believe that in this area, the laws which should be passed, as far as the big national emergency strikes are concerned, are ones that will give the president more weapons with which to deal with those strikes. Now, I have a basic disagreement with Senator Kennedy, though, on this point. He has taken the position, when he first indicated in October of last year that he would even favor compulsory arbitration as one of the weapons the president might have to stop a national emergency strike. I understand in his last speech before the Steelworkers Union that he changed that position and indicated that he felt that government seizure might be the best way to stop a strike which could not be settled by collective bargaining. I do not believe we should have either compulsory arbitration or seizure. I think the moment that you give to the union on the one side and the management on the other side the escape hatch of eventually going to government to get it settled, that most of these great strikes will end up being settled by government, and that will be in the end, in my opinion, wage control. It will mean price control, all the things that we do not want. I do believe, however, that we can give to the President of the United States powers in addition to what he presently has in the fact-finding area, which would enable him to be more effective than we have been in handling these strikes. One last point I should make. The record in handling them has been very good during this administration. We have had less man-hours lost by strikes in these last 7 years than we had in the previous 7 years by a great deal. And I only want to say that however good the record is, it's got to be better. Because in this critical year period of the 60s, we've got to move forward. All Americans must move forward together, and we have to get the greatest cooperation possible between labor and management. We cannot afford stoppages of massive effect on the economy when we're in the terrible competition we're in with the Soviets.
Senator, your comment?
Well, I always have difficulty recognizing my positions when they're stated by the Vice President. I never suggested that compulsory arbitration was a solution for national emergency disputes. I'm opposed to that. I was opposed to it in October 1958. I have suggested that the President should be given other weapons to protect the national interest in case of national emergency strikes beyond the injunction provision of the Taft-Hartley Act. I don't know what other weapons the Vice President is talking about. I'm talking about giving him 4 or 5 tools. Not only the fact-finding committee that he now has under the injunction provision, not only the injunction, but also the power of the fact-finding commission to make recommendations. Recommendations which would not be binding, but nevertheless would have great force of public opinion behind them. One of the additional powers that I would suggest would be seizure. There might be others. By the President having 5 powers, 4 or 5 powers, and he only has very limited powers today, neither the company nor the union would be sure which power would be used. And therefore, there would be a greater incentive on both sides to reach an agreement themselves without taking it to the government. The difficulty now is the President's course is quite limited. He can set up a fact-finding committee. The fact-finding committee's powers are limited. He can provide an injunction if there's a national emergency for 80 days. Then the strike can go on. And there are no other powers or actions that the President could take unless he went to the Congress. This is a difficult and sensitive matter. But to state my view precisely, the President should have a variety of things he could do. He could leave the parties in doubt as to which one he would use. And therefore, there would be incentive. Instead of, as now, steel companies were ready to take the strike because they felt the injunction of 80 days would break the union, which didn't happen.
The next question is by Mr. Cater for Senator Kennedy.
Mr. Kennedy, Vice President Nixon says that he has costed the two-party platforms and that yours would run at least $10 billion a year more than his. You have denied his figures. He has called on you to supply your figures. Would you do that?
Yes, I have stated in both debates and state again that I believe in a balanced budget and have supported that concept during my 14 years in the Congress. The only 2 times when an unbalanced budget is warranted would be during a serious recession, and we had that in '58 in an unbalanced budget of $12 billion, or a national emergency where there should be large expenditures for national defense, which we had in World War II and during part of the Korean War. On the question of the cost of our budget, I have stated that it's my best judgment that our agricultural program will cost $1.5 billion, possibly $2 billion less than the present agricultural program. My judgment is that the program the Vice President put forward, which is an extension of Mr. Benson's program, will cost $1 billion more than the present program, which costs about $6 billion a year, the most expensive in history. We spent more money on agriculture in the last 8 years than the 100 years of the Agricultural Department before that. Secondly, I believe that the high interest rate policy that this administration has followed has added about $3 billion a year to interest on the debt, merely funding the debt, which is a burden on the taxpayers. I would hope under a different monetary policy that it would be possible to reduce that interest rate burden, at least $1 billion. Third, I think it's possible to gain a $700 million to $1 billion through tax changes, which I believe would close up loopholes on dividend withholding, on expense accounts. Fourthly, I have suggested that the medical care for the aged and the bill which the Congress now has passed and the President signed, if fully implemented, would cost $1 billion on the Treasury out of the Treasury Fund and $1 billion by the state. The proposal that I have put forward, and which many of the members of my party support, is for medical care financed under Social Security, which would be financed under the Social Security taxes, which is less than 3 cents a day per person for medical care, doctors' bills, nurses, hospitals when they retire. It is actuarially sound. So in my judgment, we would spend more money in this administration on aid to education. We'd spend more money on housing. We'd spend more money, and I hope more wisely, on defense than this administration has done. But I believe that the next administration should work for a balanced budget, and that would be my intention. Mr. Nixon misstates my figures constantly, which is, of course, his right. But the fact of the matter is, here is where I stand, and I just want to have it on the public record.
Mr. Vice President, Senator Kennedy has indicated on several occasions in this program tonight that I've been misstating his record and his figures. I will issue a white paper after this broadcast quoting exactly what he said on compulsory arbitration, for example, and the record will show that I have been correct. Now, as far as his figures are concerned here tonight, he again is engaging in this, what I would call mirror game of here it is and here it isn't. On the one hand, for example, he suggests that as far as his medical care program is concerned, that really isn't a problem because it's from Social Security. But Social Security is a tax. The people pay it. It comes right out of your paycheck. This doesn't mean that the people aren't going to be paying the bill. He also indicates, as far as his agricultural program is concerned, that he feels it will cost less than ours. Well, all that I can suggest is that all the experts who have studied the program indicate that it is the most fantastic program, the worst program insofar as its effect on the farmers that America has ever had foisted upon it in an election year or any other time. And I would also point out that Senator Kennedy left out a part of the cost of that program, a 25% rise in food prices that the people would have to pay. Now, are we going to have that when it isn't going to help the farmers? I don't think we should have that kind of a program. Then he goes on to say that he's going to change the interest rate situation and we're going to get some more money that way. Well, what he's saying there, in effect, we're going to have inflation. We're going to go right back to what we had under Mr. Truman when he had political control of the Federal Reserve Board. I don't believe we ought to pay our bills through inflation, through a phony interest rate.
Next, Mr. Drummond's question for Vice President Nixon.
Mr. Nixon, before the convention, you and Governor Rockefeller said jointly that the nation's economic growth ought to be accelerated. And the Republican platform states that the nation needs to quicken the pace of economic growth. Is it fair, therefore, Mr. Vice President, to conclude that you feel that there has been insufficient economic growth during the past 8 years? And if so, what would you do beyond present administration policies to step it up?
Mr. Drummond, I am never satisfied with the economic growth of this country. I'm not satisfied with it even if there were no communism in the world, but particularly when we're in the kind of a race we're in, we have got to see that America grows just as fast as we can, provided we grow soundly. Because even though we have maintained, as I pointed out in our first debate, the absolute gap over the Soviet Union, even though the growth in this administration has been twice as much as it was in the Truman administration, that isn't good enough. because America must be able to grow enough not only to take care of our needs at home for better education and housing and health, all these things we want. We've got to grow enough to maintain the forces that we have abroad and to wage the non-military battle for the world, in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America. It's going to cost more money, and growth will help us to win that battle. Now, what do we do about it? And here, I believe, basically, that what we have to do is to stimulate that sector of America, the private enterprise sector of the economy, in which there is the greatest possibility for expansion. So that is why I advocate a program of tax reform, which will stimulate more investment in our economy. In addition to that, we have to move on other areas that are holding back growth. I refer, for example, to distressed areas. We have to move into those areas with programs so that we make adequate use of the resources of those areas. We also have to see that all of the people of the United States, the tremendous talents that our people have, are used adequately. That's why in this whole area of civil rights, the equality of opportunity for employment and education is not just for the benefit of the minority groups, it's for the benefit of the nation, so that we can get the scientists and the engineers and all the rest that we need. And in addition to that, we need programs, particularly in higher education, which will stimulate scientific breakthroughs, which will bring more growth. Now, what all this, of course, adds up to is this. America has not been standing still. Let's get that straight. Anybody who says America's been standing still for the last 7.5 years hasn't been traveling around America. He's been traveling in some other country. We have been moving. We have been moving much faster than we did in the Truman years. But we can and must move faster. And that's why I stand so strongly for programs that will move America forward in the 60s. Move her forward so that we can stay ahead of the Soviet Union and win the battle for freedom and peace.
Senator Kennedy.
Well, first, may I correct a statement which was made before that under my agricultural program, food prices would go up 25%. That's untrue. The farmer who grows wheat gets about 2.5 cents out of a 25-cent loaf of bread. Even if you put his income up 10%, that'd be 2 3/4%, 3 cents out of that 25 cents. The man who grows tomatoes, it costs less for those tomatoes than it does for the label on the can. And I believe when the average hour for many farmers' wage is about 50 cents an hour, he should do better. But anybody who suggests that that program would come to any figure indicated by the Vice President is in error. The Vice President suggested a number of things. He suggested that we aid distressed areas. The administration has vetoed that bill passed by the Congress twice. He suggested we pass an aid to education bill. The administration and the Republican majority in the Congress has opposed any realistic aid to education. And the Vice President cast a deciding vote against federal aid for teachers' salaries in the Senate, which prevented that being added. This administration and this country last year had the lowest rate of economic growth, which means jobs, of any major industrialized society in the world in 1959. And when we have to find 25,000 new jobs a week for the next 10 years, we're going to have to grow more. Governor Rockefeller says 5%. Democratic platform and others say 5%. Many say 4.5%. The last 8 years, the average growth has been about 2.5%. That's why we don't have full employment today.
Mr. McGee has the next question for Senator Kennedy.
Senator Kennedy, a moment ago you mentioned tax loopholes. Now, your running mate, Senator Lyndon Johnson, is from Texas, an oil-producing state and one that many political leaders feel is in doubt in this election year. And reports from there say that oil men in Texas are seeking assurance from Senator Johnson that the oil depletion allowance will not be cut. The Democratic platform pledges to plug loopholes in the tax laws and refers to inequitable depletion allowance as being conspicuous loopholes. My question is, do you consider the 27.5% depletion allowance inequitable, and would you ask that it be cut?
Now, Mr. McGee, there are about 104 commodities that have some kind of depletion allowance, different kind of minerals, including oil. I believe all of those should be gone over in detail to make sure that no one is getting a tax break, to make sure that no one is getting away from paying the taxes he ought to pay. That includes oil, it includes all kinds of minerals, it includes everything within the range of taxation. We want to be sure it's fair and equitable. It includes oil abroad. Perhaps that oil abroad should be treated differently than the oil here at home. Now, the oil industry recently has had hard times, particularly some of the smaller producers. They're moving about 8 or 9 days in Texas. But I can assure you that if I'm elected president, the whole spectrum of taxes will be gone through carefully, And if there's any inequities in oil or any other commodity, then I would vote to close that loophole. I have voted in the past to reduce the depletion allowance for the largest producers, for those from $5 million down, to maintain it at 27.5%. I believe we should study this and other allowances, tax expense, dividend expenses, and all the rest, and make a determination of how we can stimulate growth